Brittany Arts, and I am here to talk to you guys today about eczema. Now, eczema is rarely straightforward, and what triggers one child or adult might not trigger another child or adult, but the root cause of eczema tends to be relatively the same. The question is, when can we get to treating the root cause, and what type of mitigation or stabilization do we have to do first? So some of the signs that you might be seeing in a child or even an adult that has eczema would be hives first and foremost. That's usually the first sign that something is going on. This typically happens due to environmental allergens. It can happen due to food. Now, food doesn't always have to have an anaphylactic type allergic reaction. It doesn't always cause your throat to close. And despite what a lot of people might think, subsequent exposures of allergens, true allergens, actually cause stronger and stronger reactions. So it's very rare that, for example, a parent that is worried about giving their 6-month-old, peanut butter, giving it to them one time only primes the immune system. That wouldn't be enough to actually tell whether or not they have a food reaction. Now, back in the day, when I was having kids kind of early on, one of the recommendations was to wait until 2 years old to expose your child to certain allergens, things like honey and eggs and peanut butter, nuts in general. And what we're finding is that we're actually causing the immune system to go on high alert the longer we wait to introduce allergens to children. This could be one of the clues as to why we're seeing more and more children with eczema. So what we want to do is we want to give small doses of these typical allergens a lot earlier on than what we've been told in the past, and we want to be consistent with it. An immune system that has never been exposed to something before needs to be exposed to it multiple times over the course of a few weeks so that it can really learn to tolerate that allergen. So foods can definitely be a trigger, but not in the sense of anaphylaxis like most people think. Foods can also be a trigger for your gut, especially if, again, root cause, we're dealing with something like a leaky gut to begin with. Foods will cause what are called IgG, sensitive reactions. Now, IgG is a type of antibody that typically is mobilized when we're dealing with another type of antigen or pathogen in the blood, like a viral infection. For example, IgG antibodies are the ones that prime our immune system when we're given things like vaccines. They're the ones that really hold memory. IgG also tells our immune system to have a systemic inflammatory reaction. And again, if that is supposed to be in response to something like a virus, that reaction is there on purpose. It does things like increases body temperature to try to kill off the viral infection. It increases inflammation in your GI tract and all over your body. And it's doing that to try to get rid of the thing that shouldn't be there. We shouldn't be having IgG reactions to foods, but it happens all the time, and it happens as a result of leaky gut. So there's a big difference when it comes to food reactions if we're talking about an anaphylactic food reaction or just a food sensitivity. But both of those can absolutely be triggers for an eczema flare. Other things that flare eczema would be your environment. So not just environmental or seasonal allergens, things like pollen in the environment, but we also see a lot of issues with exposure to things like pesticides, even microplastics, phthalates, things like BPA. All of those things will be triggers for an immune system, for an eczema flare. But environmental allergens, particularly mold, can be a little bit harder to track down. Now, when I suspect mold in a household, I'm really looking at how are the other members of the household reacting to their environment. It's not everyone who reacts the same way to mold, but usually there are some clues that lead us to suspect that as being an issue. If you know the history of your home and you know whether you've had water damage at some point, if you've even had things like mold mitigated in the past, chances are it is still an issue and there's still something kind of underlying that's growing in there. We'll see a lot of nosebleeds in other kids in the household or the child who has eczema. We'll see flares that are really difficult to come out of. So I have a patient right now that came to me because Her prior practitioner tried to go really hard with some gut work without stabilizing this 2-year-old system first. So she was in a really, really bad flare when I got her. We tried kind of all of the traditional calming things that we could, and we could not seem to make any progress with her in the environment that she was in. Now, I didn't know this until she left and went on vacation with her family, and she was gone for a week, and all of a sudden, everything started to stabilize. That was a huge clue that something was going on in the house. Her mom then told me that a couple of the other kids in the house had been having reactions like hives. One of her other children was having constant nosebleeds. And that's kind of when all the light bulbs start to go off and you're like, I think we need to get your house tested for mold. Now, I don't assume mold in all eczema cases, but in a case where it's really difficult to get a child to stabilize, even when we're using things like low-dose prednisone that should have no issue stabilizing that child at all, that's when we really have to look at, why are we filling and overfilling this histamine bucket? Why are we getting these breakthrough flares when we're using a strong medication to kind of suppress that? And again, I don't use prednisone long term, but in certain cases, if we can't get a child stabilized, we cannot safely move forward into dealing with root cause. So let's talk about root cause. Well, we know we can't get a child better in an environment that is triggering. So that's something that we really have to consider. So that's something that parents need to do the testing for, bring in a local company, have that mitigation done, probably leave the home while that's happening. And in the meantime, if we can get that child stabilized, then we can really start to work on root cause, which is always going to be in the gut. So there are a lot of different types of stool tests out there. There are a couple of different brands that I like and I use depending on the scenario. If it's an eczema case, I usually like to do a test that really maps out the entire microbiome. I'm not just looking for specific bacterial triggers. I'm really looking at what is the entire landscape. Do we have certain bacteria that are overgrown, certain bacteria that are undergrown, and just how much integrity is left in that mucosal layer of the large intestine. Once we have a lot of inflammation over time, which usually starts from infancy, from birth, once we have all of that inflammation causing damage to the internal layer of our intestines, we end up with what's called leaky gut. Now, leaky gut is something, it's a term I think that is really thrown around and really misunderstood and actually sounds a lot more benign when you say it than it is. Leaky gut means that there's been enough inflammation in your colon for a long enough period of time that it has actually broken down the cells that are supposed to be pretty banded together. There's not really supposed to be any gaps between the cells, the enterocytes in your colon. When they're inflamed, they kind of swell and burst, and it leads to these huge gaps. And that means every time you have a bowel movement or stool forming in your colon, toxins can actually start to leach through that colon wall and back into your bloodstream. Now, add on top of that, that one of the contributing factors to this is usually histamine-producing bacteria. You end up with kind of this cascade of issues. So we have bacteria that produce histamine. We have an immune system that produces histamine in an attempt to correct the bacterial imbalance. And then we have toxins that are leaking. Now, toxins don't just have to be toxins from our environment. Toxins can be things like food proteins that are getting into our bloodstream, causing these IgG reactions. And again, it just becomes this immune system that is on high alert. An immune system that's been on high alert like that for a long enough period of time is also going to put your nervous system on high alert. Now, this is where most of my work begins. When we're talking about stabilizing a child who has eczema, we have to work on the nervous system of that child first, but we also have to work on the nervous system of that child's parents. Eczema is incredibly triggering for the entire family. If you have a child who has eczema, you know what that feels like when you go through these kinds of waves, these relapse remittent phases where a child looks really well and they're nice and clear, and then you have this kind of triggered flare that happens and now they're miserable and they're crying and they're not sleeping and they're itching themselves, and It makes life really difficult for everyone in the house, and it is a heartbreaking thing to go through as a parent. So this child that I just told you about, who was out of the house and had gotten so much better even while on vacation, even while in the heat, even while running around outside in the environment with the pollen and all of those things, this child then came home and was extremely triggered and went back into a flare that became really difficult for us to deal with. That experience put her parents on very high alert. And that's when, I start to get all of kind of the panic texts. This is a time where I can start to teach parents what to do in a situation like this to keep the calm in the household and keep the calm in the child's nervous system so that we don't exacerbate a flare that's already happening. Once we can get a child with eczema stabilized, that's where we can really do the root of our work. And this doesn't involve heavy hitting antimicrobials, at least not at first. What we want to do is we want to start to restore the integrity of that intestinal lining in as gentle a way as possible and introduce certain types of probiotics. And this is based on their stool test. So we never just give a random probiotic. We want to make sure we're giving certain types of probiotics that we know are going to start to restore balance to the microbiome. And that sometimes just means that we're kind of crowding out the bad guys. So we don't always just want to go for the kill. Sometimes we can actually kind of come in around the sides and we can start to crowd out the bacteria that shouldn't be there. That work takes time. It took time for your children to exhibit the signs of eczema on the outside. You don't just automatically get an eczema flare. That is something that's kind of brewing under the surface for usually years by the time it gets to the point that a child is coming to see me. So it takes time for this, and it takes patience, and it takes a lot of resilience, especially on the parents' part. If I've seen anything, it's that kids are usually a lot more resilient than their parents, and that's okay. Sometimes that's just the way it is. Parents have more, I think, burden on their nervous system, and so it becomes a little bit harder for them to keep things in perspective. But if we can really start to work on root cause and work on the resilience of everyone's nervous system in the household, then we can start to make some real headway. Keeping in mind that healing is rarely linear. It would be wonderful if it was just kind of a one and done and we got to fix it overnight, but it does take a bit of patience and a bit of resilience on everyone's part. Eczema is hopefully not something that you have to deal with forever, but it is definitely something that requires a lot of attention while we're going through treatment, and a lot of understanding that we may have some flares and we may have, some steps backwards along the way, but we are always headed in the right direction, which is long-term health and wellness for your child. If this is something that you've been dealing with and you don't even know where to start or end anymore, I would love to speak to you and kind of get a history about what's been going on with your child. So you guys can check out my Instagram page, most of my socials, Facebook, YouTube. But the best way to get in touch with me is to go to my website, naturalfertilityandpediatrics.com. You can submit a query for a consultation, or you can shoot us a text.